I'm Holly and welcome back to my channel. This week we're going to be going over how to use household items as a basis mold for making hand-built functional pieces. So I have a couple of things in my house that I really enjoy using and I really like the shape of them, and so I want to see if we can use them to make them out of clay. I have this plate and this bowl. I got them both from Target. You can use them, you know, just like you would anything else that you buy, but I want to make them out of ceramics, that way I don't have any plastic in my house. And so I'm going to be showing you guys how to essentially take things that you have in your home and make them into ceramic pieces. You can do this with things that are plastic, glass, ceramic, any sort of materials that you have, even if it is just like a decorative bowl and you really like the shape of it or the way that it looks. We can go ahead and use that to essentially translate that into clay by using it as a mold. So I'm going to be showing you guys how to do that today. So I have a couple of different objects I'll be showing you. So plate, bowl. I do also have this little ceramic one that I made a while ago. It's kind of like a ramekin, and I have this like glass jar that I've just been using as a cup these last couple of weeks. And so we're just gonna jump right into it. So the first thing that you want is the piece that you end up wanting to take a mold of. It is kind of important with this that you don't have like a ton of like lines or textures and things like that in your original piece that you're going to be using as a mold, if you don't want that in your clay. So if you end up having, you know, like something like this with a jar, a lot of these will have a ton of ridges or things at the bottom. If you don't want that, don't use something like that. It's just going to make for a lot of cleanup later and just more work. So you kind of want things to be as close to the shape or the style that you want, and that way it's going to be a very easy translation over into our clay. Again, too, with plates, sometimes you will find that a lot of these will have a ridge. This one just kind of slopes right here, and I really like that, but sometimes you'll find that they'll have a line between the rim of the plate and the base of the plate. And if you don't want that, again, probably not the plate you want to be using. So the next thing that we're gonna want is some sort of like release. As you may have noticed by now, clay really likes to stick to things that aren't canvas, plaster, or really those are kind of the two main ones. So I always am working on a piece of canvas, so that way it's easy to pick my clay up off the table, things like that. So if you're finding that your clay really just sticks to the table when you're hand building, it's probably because you need something underneath it. I would suggest buying like a cheap canvas from Michael's or Walmart or somewhere like that, and then just like ripping the staples off of the back and using that for your tablecloth, essentially. What I mean by release for our molds is going to be something so that way our clay doesn't stick to it when we end up using it to kind of press into or press onto. So you can do this a number of ways. You can use cooking spray, cornstarch, baby powder, talcum powder, or paper towels. I'm gonna go with this paper towel method. It is my favorite personally, and I will show you guys why in a minute. But essentially, if you have any of those, it's gonna work. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, everyone, so we have our slab already kind of rolled out. Now, if you wanna get rid of any sort of texture of the canvas or things like that, you see that this really isn't a perfect piece of clay. I do recommend a metal rib to just kind of smooth things out, because you kind of want to prepare your clay so that way once you place your clay into the mold, it's going to end up basically being done from then on. So getting it as close to finished as you want before going through this process. And I think that's good. Now, if you want to add any sort of like textures or things like that, now would be the time. You can use a lot of household items for textures if you'd like. I'm just going to be using this doily that I have. These work great. You can find these at estate sales, thrift stores, things like that. They're usually pretty cheap, but essentially if you wanted to, you know, make some sort of cool pattern for your mold, because the perk of doing hand-built pottery and functional pieces is the fact that you can get textures in places that are typically harder to do when they are thrown on the wheel, and things that are a little more organic. So I'm just gonna place this on here and slowly roll this in. And we'll just peel this up. And now we have I can get you guys to be able to see it here, a really nice texture. So Next thing we want to do is figure out what part of this we want to take for our bowl shape. So I can see that, you know, we have our bowl. I go the top side down on most of these, and I'll find the part of the pattern that I want to be able to use for this. I'll kind of use this a little further over here. I usually want to make sure there's a little bit of extra on each edge. Now we're going to go ahead and take our needle tool. Now, if I just cut along this line here, this is going to end up being a little short when we use the clay, just because it doesn't really account for the angle that we're going to be going at here. So if you're okay with this ending up being a little shorter, go ahead and just cut right along the edge here. I am probably going to go about 1 centimeter out on each edge, and this doesn't have to be perfect. If you guys are people that want things to be really precise, I would suggest using a slightly larger bowl or circular shape. You can cut this out on a piece of cardboard and just add a circle and then trace it. For me, I'm just going to kind of cut along the outside and give myself a bit of excess around each edge. All right. So we'll kind of peel off the rest of it. Now I'm gonna save the rest of this slab for the smaller bowl project I'll be showing you guys, but I'm just gonna kind of peel this all away. And there we have our template for our bowl. So like I was saying earlier, you do kind of want to prep your clay as well as you possibly can to make sure that once you place this on your mold, it's going to be very easy. What I like to do is take my sponge and put it in a little bit of water and just kind of go over the edges. That way these don't end up being sharp, because you do always want to think about how your functional pieces will end up after they've been fired. So if you have any really sharp edges, that they don't end up staying that sharp through the firing, because you don't want a bowl that's going to cut the edge of your lips or your hands or anything like that. So I'm gonna pick it up, flip it over, do it on the other side. Now, kind of how we smoothed this out in the beginning when it was a large slab, I'm just gonna do that again right here so you guys can kind of see, like this little bit right here. I don't want that in my bowl. And I'll hit it one more time with the sponge. Okay. So now that we have our slab exactly the way that we want it, we're gonna go ahead and grab our bowl, or gonna be our mold, and we want to decide on which way we wanna do this. So I can either press this into the inside, or I can push it over the outside here. For this sake, what I'm gonna be doing is pushing this on the inside here, just so that way I can show you both ways. So if we go inside, you're gonna get a little bit more of an edge here, and if we go outside, it's going to end up being a little less dramatic when we start to kind of pull this over, because adding a little bit more depth there kind of decreases how sharp that angle will be. So now we want to grab our release agent here. For this one, I'm going to go with the baby powder. So I have my baby powder here, and I'm just going to put a little bit. There we go. Put a little bit of this here and a little bit of this onto my clay itself. You can just do one. I like to do both just to make sure. So kind of give this a nice rub around, and with cooking spray or cornstarch, this would be the same. And now we want to decide, do we want this bowl to end up having the lace on the bottom or the lace on the inside? Because I'm going to want to eat out of it, I'm probably going to put this onto the bottom here, just to make sure that, you know, our food doesn't end up wanting to stick into that lace pattern here. So I'm gonna take this, and I guess that really didn't make a whole lot of sense there. So let's go the other way around. We'll put the lace on the inside because I have my baby powder there. And this kind of just sits in here, and you're just gonna wanna take your fingers and just lightly press into this a little bit at a time, so that way it's a gradual sink here. Don't wanna push too hard, because you wanna make sure that all of your edges are kind of sinking equally into that bowl. So And I ended up doing the lace pattern up just because I put the baby powder on the wrong side, because you do want that to be the thing that kind of creates a barrier between the plastic and the clay, so that way it doesn't stick. And that is probably the most important part of this entire video, is making sure that you have some sort of release agent. So I got this in here. We don't want to press like this into the wall here. You don't want this to really stick, and you don't want to mess up your pattern either. You just want this to lightly sink into that shape. So you can see we do have our bowl here. Now, notice how this is still a little bit off from the top here. So you do want to play around with how much excess you leave around the edges when we do that initial cut. If you want this to be really close to it, there really isn't a precise way to measure this other than just trial and error, in my opinion. I did give myself a centimeter extra around each edge. Had I not done this, this here probably would have been all the way down here, and it would have been a much smaller bowl. So maybe half an inch. And also you want to think about how your clay is going to shrink. So if you are working with a porcelain clay body or a whiter clay body, it's probably going to shrink a little bit more, so you want to leave a little bit extra. And if this ends up flaring a little bit over the top, that's okay too. What we don't want is these edges coming up and over this here where you are wrapping it around the edge. What that's going to do is it's going to make for a really hard release, and it probably will crack around that edge. So there is our first bowl. So with the extra of this, I'm going to be going over my smaller, like ramekin sized bowl. Now this one has a much more dramatic angle here at the bottom, as you know, this one ends up having a kind of flares out a little bit. This one just goes straight up. You do want to be a little bit more careful on things like this, just because of the fact that it's going to be harder to measure that outer edge here. And also, you know, if it starts to angle inward at the top, you don't want to make your clay also go inward, because then you can't pull this out if you're going around the outside, and vice versa on the inside. So I will show you what I mean by that in a minute, and we'll go ahead and trace this. I'm going to make this one much larger around the outside. Okay. So this one, we'll go ahead and grab our sponge again. We'll wrap around, make sure that this is all nice and even here. Now with this one, I'm going to be using the paper towel release method, mainly because I'm gonna, instead of be pushing onto the inside, I'm gonna be going over the top with this one. So I'm gonna place my paper towel over the top. And it's okay that when I wrap this, that, you know, there is some part of this that is not going to be covered with the paper towel. That's fine. As long as we have a paper towel in there, it should be fine. Go ahead and lift this up. And I'm gonna want the lace pattern on the outside for this one. Try and find the middle as best as I can. And we are just going to push down and over. Now, these can be a little bit trickier, especially when you have something a little bit more narrow, like this one is at the bottom, because your clay might want to kind of crinkle and fold when it gets down there. So you can kind of see how this is having a hard time retracting in that way. You want to be careful with these, and that, you know, especially with working with patterns, that you aren't destroying your pattern trying to get this thing to fit the way that you want it to. Now there are pros and cons of going over the inside versus going over the outside. Going over the outside can be really nice if you want your pattern on the bottom or on the outer edge of something. However, if you are getting your clay pretty flush to the pot that you are working on, when this starts to dry, clay shrinks. So if you don't take this off before it's bone dry, odds are it's probably going to crack, because of the fact that the clay is trying to shrink and there's something on the inside of it stopping it from doing so. So you want to make sure when you go over the tops like this, that you end up taking this off before it gets a little bit too much. Now, I like the paper towel method here the most, mainly because if we want to, we can just kind of end up using this to lift up, and then we still have our piece. I do like to let mine set up a little bit, let it get to like leather hard before I pull it off, because that is before it starts shrinking, but after it's dry enough that it won't lose its shape after we take it off. But the downside is if you forget about it, it will crack Whereas pros to this one is that you do end up wanting to, you can leave this one in here until it's completely bone dry and it'll just come right out, because if it shrinks, it, you know, the bowl on the outside is not shrinking too, it is just this on the inside. The downside to not using the paper towel and using the baby powder or the cornstarch or the talcum powder is it's not always an immediate release. Sometimes you might have enough in there that this should just pop right out, and sometimes it doesn't, and you kind of have to wait for the clay to dry enough that it starts to loosen a little bit more, and with the help of whatever your release agent is, will pop out later, but it might take a little bit longer. So we're gonna go ahead and put these aside, and we'll go over the plate and jar. So I have my slab ready to go for my plate. Now the plates are gonna take a lot more clay just because you wanna get these wider and just make sure that you have all around enough. But with the plate mold, I am not as worried about making sure that there are like an excess bit around my plate, just because it is not as important to me, and it might be different for you, that I have enough to kind of accentuate this edge a bit more like I do with my bowl coming up. I'm not as worried about that angle because it's a plate. So I'm just gonna cut directly along my plate mold, and this can be easier for you to get that perfect shape that you want. But because this does have a slight like label that sticks out a bit on the bottom, I will be using the interior of this plate, and I will be using my paper towel method again. Now you will all probably have a different preference on what your release method is, but I am always a paper towel person. There is more surface area. I'm gonna use 2. You don't have to, but I like this the best. And we'll always make sure our edges are nice and smooth before we go ahead and do this. And when you pick this up, you want to be very careful that you're just kind of lifting one edge and trying to get your hand all the way under there, so that way you're not lifting up by one small edge, because then you'll end up stretching your clay out in different areas that you probably don't want it to be. We'll grab our rib to kind of get rid of this crease here. Now you can use your damp sponge to kind of smooth out all of this. However, you're gonna end up making this much moisture, and it's going to be harder to pick up with more moisture pushed into this clay. So I always use the metal rib to clean up. Now that this is done, we'll go ahead and kind of get this close enough that it's an easy transfer from one to the other. I'm gonna be really careful when I pick this up again. Move this over. We're gonna just try our best to find the middle, so I like to line up the edge closest to me with the clay and let that in there. Now, this is a prime example of why I like to use my paper towels. Is over here there's a lot of overhang, and over here it's kind of sunk all the way into our mold. So with the paper towels, it's really easy for me to just kind of pick up and pull into our spot that we really want it to be in, and that way it makes it easier for us to move things over. And I'm just gonna lightly press this in along the edges. The bottom is just gonna lay flat, so I don't really have to worry too much about that, but I'm just gonna kind of lightly take my fingers and press into this edge here. All right. And now if you want to go back in with your sponge, you can. The more moisture that is in this, the longer you're going to have to wait to be able to take this out. But I am not in any rush, so I'm just going to kind of get rid of my finger marks here. But if you like your finger marks, go ahead and just keep pressing, enjoy, you know, the texture it's making, things like that. So we're going to go ahead and move this off to the side. We now have our plate. Lastly, we're going to show the jar. So you can kind of see that this bevels in at the top, and you do want to be very cautious of something like this. Now, just for reusability and, you know, just the sake of finishing this video for you guys, I'm gonna take the clay off of this, because now that we have our bowl here, I'm just gonna go ahead and use this. Now, you can end up messing with your clay as much as you want. Now, we can see that this is a bit wider than our cup here, so we're gonna end up taking this and really, you know, pushing along the edges here. Now, this is where things will kind of start to crinkle a bit, and cups are going to be a lot harder to use this on. I don't recommend it a ton, mainly because we end up getting kind of something like this along the lines, and you're gonna have to do a lot of smoothing out. It's almost like a lot of pinching, and you're gonna kind of want to push this onto it. Now, these are kind of what I think is the exception to really pushing, mainly because, you know, this method doesn't work as well for more narrow objects. You can kind of see we have something like this. This comes right out, which is really nice. Now, had this clay gone up and over this edge and started to angle in, you wouldn't be able to pull this out anymore. So anytime that you're using something like this that bevels inward at the top, you want to make sure that your clay stops before that happens, because it's just going to be a lot harder to use that way, and you're better off, you know, bringing it all the way up and then, you know, adding a coil or some extra clay at the top inward once your actual shape itself, or whatever you're using as your mold, is already pulled out of it. So as you can kind of see, when we pull out this paper towel here, you have quite a few cracks, creases, things like that. You can end up going in and just smoothing this out, which I will show you. So we'll put our paper towel back in here. We'll put this in. And where we have our creases and things like that, we can just go ahead and use our sponge, our finger, or we can go ahead and go back to the metal rib here and really try to smooth this out. Now, this is going to be a lot harder and a lot more cleanup, but if you do kind of like the way that this looks organically, where it just ends up, you know, having uneven edges and differences in thickness and texture and things like that, which is, you know, all up to your preference, then that's fine. We could just leave it like this, and then we have this funky little candle holder cup thing, whatever we want it to be. But so one more thing I do want to note is when we did end up kind of angling this a little bit more over this edge here, you can kind of see that this edge has this line. You'll see in the inside that that line did translate over a bit. So again, if you don't want specific lines or marks or things like that that are on the piece that you were using as a mold, probably don't want to use it as a mold unless you're okay with doing all of the cleanup for that. And you can also notice that because of how harsh we pushed down on that and how harsh that angle was, that we do kind of have some of these stress cracks here in the outer edges. And so you might want to go in with your finger and, you know, clean those up a bit. Probably a little bit of water here would be okay, just because of the fact that, you know, most of the time a lot of these cracks occur because of the fact that something's been overworked, or because we've added a lot of pressure or stress or stretched it in an angle that it just didn't like. With this one, I can probably bet that, you know, it has been a little overworked because I used it for this and for this as well. But you will find that, you know, certain techniques work better for you, and certain shapes you like a little bit better as a mold, rather than either throwing them on the wheel or slab building them entirely themselves. So there is that. All right, everyone, so there you have it. That is how to use household items as molds. So this can really be done with so many different things. So feel free to, you know, try this out and experiment on different types of shapes, forms, things like that that you find around the house. Almost anything can be used as a clay tool. I do want to add though that with all of our molds and things that we, you know, ended up making today, please wait until this gets to at least leather hard for you to try to remove it or end up taking it out of the mold completely, especially with our bowls and things like that, mainly because if I were to pull this out now and it's not fully set up yet, and by that I mean it just hasn't dried enough, this angle isn't going to stay, it's just going to kind of flop over. And this is going to be especially true for our bowl shapes. So yeah, do make sure that these are dry. If you did end up using cornstarch, baby powder, talcum powder, any of that, you do want to end up making sure that you're kind of seeing this start to peel away from the edge. So you'll see like a millimeter or two of like starting there to be space in between the clay and what you're using as a mold. And at that point you can kind of, you know, lift it upside down. You never want to like peel it out. You always kind of want to flip and, you know, lift up. Mine are obviously not set up yet because we just did them, but they should be good in a couple of hours. It really depends on what climate you're in. So again, if you're in a drier area, it's going to dry a bit faster. And if you're in a wetter, more humid area, it's definitely going to take a bit longer for you. But I do hope that this was helpful. And if you liked this video, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and I will see you all next week. Thanks for watching.